How do you create that habit? How do you overcome that barrier? So it starts with a cue, and then there's a routine and a reward. Some of the most complex habits perform better when we perform them unconsciously. The process becomes easier and easier because that whole process becomes a habit in itself. We've said multiple times on this show that cheating is encouraged. But the problem is, if you're not familiar with your cheat sheets, it is just a jumble of words in that crisis moment. And some of these clinicians, when there's something that they don't know, they will know exactly where to get the information.
Okay, you're clear. Stand by for your base.
Welcome to Loud and Clear EMS Guiding Principles, where we provide high-level education for you, the providers on the streets, but connect this back to a set of guiding principles so that you always know what to fall back on when you're out in the real world. Today we have with us, is it Jean Francois Couture? Very nice.
Oh yeah, I did some high school French.
From Canada, who just gave we're on site here at Fast 25, and he just gave a phenomenal lecture about the power of habit. And I just had to talk with him afterwards because I think we talk a lot about this journey to mastery, to excellence, what it takes, the power of simulation and mental simulation. But I think for a lot of people just starting out, it's like, how do you do that? How do you create that habit? How do you overcome that barrier? And so I loved your talk, and I want to dive into it and start with this habit loop.
Yeah, for sure. So the habit loop is obviously not something that I made up, right? And there's this great book from Charles Duhigg. He's a New York Times author. It was published over 10 years ago, and it's a very nice read, not super long if people are interested. And it really goes into the science of basically of habit, the reason why we kind of developed habit over time. And the habit loop is very simple. So it starts with a cue, and then there's a routine and a reward. So, the example that I give is, let's say you want to pick up a jogging habit. So you'll need to find a cue at first. So let's say the cue is you come back home and, you put your shoes next to the door so you don't go inside and open the TV. And then you put on your shoes, you go running. And at some point you'll associate the cue with the routine, and that'll, increase the chances of you, picking up that habit. If you really want it to work, you add the reward. So at the end, let's say like there's a smoothie that you love. So your cue is you come back home, put your shoes on. The routine is you go running. And then the reward is that you make yourself your smoothie. And over time, this will encourage you, obviously, to, get to your reward. So every time you'll see the cue, you'll think about your routine, the jogging, and the reward being the smoothie. And at some point, this will become so natural that you'll come back home and just go jogging, whether you have the reward or not. And obviously, we didn't evolve to develop like a jogging habit. And the reason why we evolved to have habit is just because there's so many things that we do in our day-to-day lives that if we were to think about them with intent every time that we did them, we would just be completely cognitive overloaded. And so the example I give is when you drive your car, right? So if you remember the first time you drove your car, it's super complicated. There's all these steps, like how does the door open? How do I set my seat? Where does the key go? Where do my feet go? But at some point after doing all these things a lot, like hundreds, thousands of times, it just becomes ingrained in habit. So, and I'm sure if your listeners think about the next time they'll sit in your car, I'm sure that they always do these things in the same step, right? We sit down, put on our seatbelt and that kind of stuff, but it becomes very automatic. And the reason for that is that so that we can drive our cars without having to think every second, right, of what we're going to do next. So that's really the idea behind that.
Yeah, there's a book called The Confident Mind, and in it, he tries to make the point that some of the most complex habits perform better when we perform them unconsciously. So you think about walking. If you were to think about walking up steps, if you were to think about what your knees are doing in every step, you would end up falling. It's similar with driving a car, as you were talking about, but you can only get there through the repetitions. We learn to walk before we run. So how do we get there? How do we start this habit? And why does it matter in medicine?
Yeah. So, and there are a few examples, like, the example I give is the ABCs. It's really pretty good in medicine to have started at training to ingrain some of these things that we do on a regular basis. And so, the ABCs in resuscitation is one of the examples. And by doing it again and again and again, it just becomes very natural. So, and I think that's one of the ways by doing it very early when you're in training, because as we start doing something one way and then we try to shift ways a bit later, obviously it's always a bit harder. But definitely, I think it's important to start early. And as we were saying, I think it's important to do them very often, but always do the things the same way. so that it really becomes ingrained the way that we do things. Yeah.
So how do we do that in medicine? And you presented this idea of the meta habit. What is that?
The idea behind that is by some sim work that we do in our sim lab, we've noticed that as we push people through like difficult simulations, even the best expert clinicians, we will come at a point where we push them to their limits. And, they can't remember exactly what's the dose of midazolam infusion for super refractory status epilepticus post-intubation, for example. I mean, there's so many things that we need to know. It's impossible to know everything. And some of these clinicians, when there's something that they don't know, they will know exactly where to get the information. And I think that's a critical part, especially in 2025. There's so many ways that we can get access to information. And then what we've noticed is that some of the clinicians don't know exactly what the answer is to the question they're asking. But then the problem is they don't know where to get that information. And that's where the problem arises, because then they start turning in circles, whereas they're looking for the information, they can't find it, they get stressed. They try to find something else, they can't find it either. The stress ramps up. And then at some point, they've been doing this for like 5-10 minutes sometimes, and the sim is not going on. And thankfully, it's simulation, but you can think how this for sure happens in real life. And so the point behind that is, how can we use habit, and what tools do we have that we can try to take that knowledge retrieval problem and bring it as close to possible to zero?
Yeah, that's so important. I think this idea, so we've said multiple times on this show that cheating is encouraged. But the problem is, if you're not familiar with your cheat sheets, it is just a jumble of words in that crisis moment. And trying to find the exact thing that you're looking for at that moment becomes impossible unless you've been familiar with it, unless you've put in the reps practicing using that cheat sheet. It's not enough just to have the cheat sheet, but you need to know how to use it and practice with it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's 100% what needs to be done. And like, even if you have 200 different places where you get your information, it doesn't matter. What matters is, for any clinical scenario, you need to know exactly where you will get your information. Sometimes it'll be your own expertise. Sometimes it'll be your local or regional or whatever your protocols that you have in place. And sometimes you need to have your own tools that that you've taken notes somewhere, or that you can use this resource for that certain situation. But the problem is, you really need to have thought about it ahead of time. You know exactly where your cheat sheets are, right? And for example, pediatric super refractory status epilepticus, where am I going to get my information? Or pick any other thing. Say like refractory postpartum hemorrhage, where do I get the information regarding that? If I need to do a crike, but I can't remember exactly what the first incision is, where can I get just-in-time training for procedures? And all these things, you need to know exactly where to get the information. But it's not at the point of care where you're supposed to do them that's the time to think about these things, right? So you need to think about these things ahead of time. And it's a lot of work, obviously, because if you want to go through all these clinical scenarios, it takes some time. And you really have to put the time in. And this is the reason why, I talked about the meta habit. And the meta habit is actually a habit of habits. So it's getting into the habits of going through these scenarios with planning and research. And like, you can do simulation as well, because, that's the best. And then once you've gotten through, let's say, refractory status epilepticus, okay, here are my first lines. I know those. If that doesn't work, where do I get the information about my second and my third lines? About intubation, where do I get ventilator management for pediatrics? And once you've gone through all these things, that you've done that subject, you've run a simulation in your head, or you've done a sim, in your workplace, if that's available to you, perfect. And then you put that one away, and then you schedule the next one. And then you repeat that process. And over time, first of all, you'll remember exactly where to get your information, but also the process becomes easier and easier, because that whole process becomes a habit in itself. And so over time, obviously, it'll take less and less time doing this, and you'll become more efficient, and it'll be easier.
I think that's a very important part, in that you realize that you're not going to be super efficient at the get-go, that this is going to take some time, that the first one is going to be a little bumpy. It's going to take a little longer than you would like it to, but with continued practice, it's going to get quicker and quicker, and you're going to be able to do more and more. Break it down for me. How do we start this?
So I think the first step is your planning and scheduling. Those are slightly different things, because I think the planning part is where you really have to say, okay, what's the spectrum or the breadth of the things that I treat in my clinical practice? Because obviously, if you never see pediatrics, well, I would argue that you would still need to think about these because, like, who knows who could happen. So you really want to write it down or make a list. And obviously, you can use AI to help you with these lists. But to really break down anything that you have in your clinical practice, even the simple things, but just write everything down. So this from the simplest to the more complex. And then a big part is going to be how much of a breakdown do you want to do? So do you want to just say trauma is one of the topics because I know that I can get all of my information comes from all the same place? Or do I want to break it down in adult and pediatric trauma or penetrating or non-penetrating trauma? So there's kind of work that needs to be done before this starts, just in terms of how do I plan? I need to know a little bit my resources ahead of time. So if I know that all the resources are the same for a certain group of conditions, then I can certainly group those together. But I would encourage people to break this down as much as possible, just because as you'll go through the simulations, obviously, it's helpful to sim a penetrating torso pediatric trauma and then to sim a adult blunt head trauma, right? So you really want to break these things down as much as possible. And then obviously, if you come up with like 250 things, then you know that it won't take you a month. It'll take a bit longer. And even if the whole process takes you, like, you go through the schedule over like 2 to 3 years, the point is that at some point you'll go through everything, right? So don't try to squeeze that in too much. Give yourself some time and then schedule. If you're able to put that in your schedule, I think like once a week is probably a good spot, once or twice a week. Doing it once a month, I don't think is often enough for you to pick up that habit. But if you do it at least once or twice a month, you pick one clinical scenario. Then the other part, and the reason exactly what you were saying, the first time you're going to do this, it's going to take some time because as you'll go through your refractory pediatric status epilepticus the first time, where do I get the information? What's the next step? But that's the whole point of doing this, right? You'll go through your mental simulation. Okay, my patient's still seizing. What's my next line? What's my next line? What's my next line? And the goal is not to remember everything that you read. It's just to find the information and remember where you found the information and know where you can get it the next time. And then after that, obviously, once you've simmed it at the same time, either you do a group sim again or you do the sim on your own, and then you repeat. And obviously, the repeating part is important because otherwise it doesn't become a habit. But so you want to repeat that and repeat that and repeat that. And from one case to another, obviously, the principle is going to become simpler. The habit's going to become ingrained and it's going to be easier and easier. And once you've gone through all your planning and you start doing it for a second time, then obviously you're going to fly through these things. So it might take like 5-10 minutes every week. But then the good part is you'll know that anything that you are faced with, you don't necessarily know the answer, but you know exactly where you will find the answer. And I think that's the big difference.
Yeah. And I think scheduling is so important too, because if you don't schedule it, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And scheduling not only the time to simulate, but the time to plan, because it is going to take some time. But realize there's a lot of upfront work when it comes to this, but understand the reward on the back end of what that upfront work is going to get you. It's going to take some time planning and researching and figuring out exactly how you're going to run that sim. But once you have that set up, you can mentally do that on the fly in perpetuity, until your protocols change or your practice changes or environment or whatnot. But the reward on the back end is the ability to just keep doing that. You've done the work already.
No, 100% agree. And, for some of these, it might take 2 hours just because it's something that you don't have a local protocol for and you don't see very often. So you might have to put in a lot of work. And for other things, you might have a complete protocol where you work if you'd see a lot of these cases and it might take you 5 minutes. But going through the process anyways, even if you're pretty comfortable, and I'm sure that if you push these simulation scenarios to like that doesn't work, that still doesn't work, that still doesn't work, you can get to the point where you'll need some extra information that you'll need to find. But yeah, I don't think it necessarily needs to be that long, but obviously putting in the work the first time is always going to be a bit longer.
Any other advice for people who are looking to form this type of habit?
I think just starting easy, as we were saying, scheduling, maybe like doing the easier ones at first, just to get going and to get comfortable with the process. I think also doing it as early as possible in your career, just because that's probably the moment where you have the biggest bang for your buck, right? Because you've not necessarily seen all these cases, you haven't had a lot of expertise. But even for people that are later in their careers, that might be thinking about a change in where they work or a change in responsibility or any of these, well, getting into that habit before you go through that change is going to help you a lot, because once you've developed that habit with knowledge that you already have, when you move or change and then you just need to add some new protocols, but you're already used to doing these simulations and these repetitions, this new knowledge will, I guarantee, fit into that meta habit a lot easier, and you'll find it a lot easier to go through that change for sure.
Thank you so much for joining us. Tell people where they can learn more about you and find you online.
You can find me on LinkedIn, Jean Francois Couture, and my email's on there as well. So please feel free to write to me.
And you have a company?
Yeah, so I'm co-founder of Parys Medical. We've created an app called Easy Resus. It's basically an app that helps for anything resuscitation in terms of protocols, medications. We're adding a new procedures section in the coming month. So really excited.
That's awesome. Where can people find that?
You're going to find it on easyresus.com. And otherwise, we're changing the name soon. It's Parys Medical. So you can find us there as well.
Okay, cool. Very cool. I think, these procedure checklists, you said you're adding a procedure, they can serve as a good jumping off point for mental simulation too, because you can mentally simulate that procedure just based on looking at that checklist.
Yeah, absolutely. And know exactly where to find it.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Perfect. Thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Loud and clear, number 2, go ahead.